You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 49, and this is your host, Brian McClanahan. And this particular podcast covers the week of October 31st through November 4th, 2016. Glad to have you back on the program. We've got a lot of great stuff to talk about. November is, just to remind you, Nonprofit Organization Month. So we've got all these months all throughout the year, all these holidays, all these special things. Well, why not capitalize that on our podcast and on our webpage and everything else? So if you're thinking about planning for your taxes for the end of the year 2016, you can make a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute to the full extent of the law. We will take anything you got to help us out, help keep this podcast going, help keep the website up, and all those other things, our programs. So we do need your help. We exist on your generous contributions alone. So please consider making a donation to the Abbeville Institute. Also, if you are listening to this podcast, share it around. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. Follow our YouTube channel. All those other things that we have, all the social media outlets. And if you're listening to this podcast and you've never been to our webpage before, if you go up there and you put your email address in, you'll be part of our email list, and you will get at least one email a week from us with our articles and other things that we like to highlight. And please do that as well. You also get a free gift, Kirkpatrick Sale's book, Emancipation Hell. So we're looking at trying to do something else with that and get you a different prize for those that we've had that book up there for a couple of years. So anyways, we're trying to do something else, but please share our material around on social media. That's how we get most of our traction and how we get most of our interest. So your help on social media is quite appreciated. Also, a tax-deductible donation would be quite appreciated. So let's talk about this week at the Abbeville Institute. We had a pretty eclectic week in the material that we had, and so we're going to start with our Halloween piece, A Plinth of Night by Randall Ivey. Now, this is an original work of fiction and a very good one, in fact. If you're a fan of Edgar Allan Poe or any of Southern Gothic horror, this is a very good little short story here. Mr. Ivey teaches in South Carolina, and he teaches literature, and he does a very good job at that. And he's a contributing author to our website. He's also an associated scholar of the Institute, and writes interesting fiction. And in this particular case, it takes place in South Carolina, or you would think that, and it's a very dark story, to say the least. So I'm not going to get into the story, but one thing you can say about it's well worth your time to read it. It won't take that much time at all. It's a short story, but a very good one. One thing you can say about Southerners, though, is that American literature would not be as rich without Southerners involved in that. And that's something that, here at the Institute we try to do and preserve what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And one of those things that's true and valuable in the Southern tradition is literature. And so two pieces this week actually focus on literature, and one sort of on literature, the last piece of the week on Louis Grizzard, comedy, and the written word is important to the South. And so when you go back and you look at, if you read any type of anthologies of American literature, they're going to ignore most Southerners. They might mention Flannery O'Connor. Of course, they're going to talk about William Faulkner. You might get those two. But then anyone else who was associated with the South, of course, you're going to get Poe. But Poe is considered to be an American, quote-unquote, author, not a Southern author. And that's unfortunate because Poe spent most of his career, literary career, in fact, in the South, writing for a Southern literary journal. And, of course, producing top-quality stories and poems. But you had a number of other antebellum and postbellum authors that were just very good. And we've highlighted them over and over again on our website. And that's something that we need to remember about the Southern tradition and what's valuable about the Southern tradition is that character that comes out of the South. And the piece on Grizzard talks about that. But it's something that's deeper than just politics or sectionalism. There's a real culture there that is often forgotten in society today because Southern culture has been so abused, maligned, and I think it's become a caricature of itself. You know, people think that the South is just, people chewing tobacco and engaging in cow tipping, right? I mean, it's backwards, it's redneck, whatever the case, whatever you want to say. And if you look at all the different ways Southerners are portrayed in modern media, that's basically it. No one thinks Southerners are intelligent. And there's a kids movie series called Cars, which the funniest character in the entire show is a tow truck named Mater, and my kids love this series. But Mater is a Southerner, and he's portrayed as stupid, and of course he's Larry the Cable Guy, and he cracks very funny jokes. But in the second installment of the movie series, there's going to be a third one this next year. Mater is the hero because he's actually very intelligent. And I thought that was pretty interesting that the guy that's considered to be this kind of, boob that doesn't know anything turns out to be the hero because he does know things. And everyone makes fun of him. And, of course, his escapades are slapstick. They're funny. But we forget at times, at our own peril, the intellectual contributions of the South in American culture. And so this particular piece is representative of that. And that is a very good story. If you like horror stories, if you like, the Twilight Zone, some of the, and I think this is more in line with the Twilight Zone than anything else. The great show back in the 1960s. One of my favorite episodes of the Twilight Zone, in fact, one of these left-wing anti-Southern blogs covered this thing, the Neo-Confederates in the Twilight Zone, right? There was one of the episodes covered kind of the macabre like this. It's a book that can freeze people. It's a witchcraft, and how Southerners were using this thing to win the war. But it's a really interesting episode, and it's not anti-South. I mean, these Confederate soldiers are seen as good men, and it's a very interesting episode. And so this left-wing blog talks about how even the Twilight Zone was captivated by Neo-Confederacy. And, we have to be careful of this because any portrayal of Confederate soldiers as good people is just way off the mark. These people were traitors, and they were evil. So you can't like them at all. The Twilight Zone was kidnapped by these Neo-Confederate thoughts. They were swamped by this very wrong view of American history. And of course, this is what we've got in the last 20 years or 30 years or so. And I'm going to talk about that again with one of the pieces that I put up with a twit that's now teaching at Princeton. And he wrote a book, and we're going to try to review this one because it's quite interesting. Anyways, in a bad way. So we've got this very good original piece of fiction, The Plinth of Night by Randall Lively. Go out there and read it. Again, well worth your time. On Tuesday, we ran a piece by Jack Marcourt, who is a great writer. He's living in Japan, and so he might be the scholar that writes for us from the greatest distance. So he's a World War II vet, and he loves Southern history, and he wrote a wonderful piece not long ago, Nullification versus Secession, and he's attended one of our conferences in Charleston. In Atlanta, I think is where he attended. Just a wonderful guy, and produces pieces here and there for us. But this is on William C. Faulkner, but not William C. Faulkner, the well-known writer, but William C. Faulkner's, the well-known writer, his great-grandfather, who was also a writer from Mississippi. But it's a kind of an unknown story about him. He was actually shot and killed in 1889 by a colleague. And so Jack gets into his story about who this William C. Faulkner was. He was actually a Confederate veteran. And it said that there's a quote that Jack says is not necessarily true, but it might be. It's that William Faulkner, the great writer, once said that he wanted to be a writer like my great-granddaddy. And perhaps the character of John Sartoris from Flags in the Dust is based on this William C. Faulkner. And so he also appeared in a series of short stories that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post and Scribner's. And then, of course, it became The Unvanquished, those stories. The Unvanquished is a very good book. It's one of the ones that Clyde Wilson recommends. And he says that the real Colonel Sartoris was, if anything, even more of a character than the fictional one depicted in the writings of his illustrious great-grandson. And so he gets into who is this William Faulkner. Of course, he fought for the Confederacy, did a very good job, apparently, in that, but he was also a lawyer. He was well interested in politics, was a Whig, and then actually became an American Party member or Know-Nothing Party member. He had a plantation in Mississippi, but he signed up and fought in the war and did a pretty good job. After the war, he got involved in a number of things, but one of those was not just studying or not just practicing law, but also establishing a school of higher education for women called Stonewall College, and then also getting involved in a rail line operation in Mississippi. But he also wrote. He wrote a number of very good books and got involved in politics, was elected to the Mississippi State Legislature. Right about that time, though, he was killed after he was elected the same day, shot in the neck. And so no one knows why, but there was several. His assailant was actually a friend of his, and there was some issues between them for years. But it's probably this William Faulkner that the other William Faulkner based one of his characters on. And so if you look at, and he mentions the fact that Faulkner's tomb there in Mississippi is exactly the same type that the other William Faulkner describes in what's now The Unvanquished. So this is a really interesting story, and it shows the continuity between the Old South and the New South. We often don't think about that. And it also shows the richness of Southern literature and how important time and place was for people, even in the 20th century, writing about who they were. You see, Southerners wrote about real people and real things. They wrote about something that's in the dirt. It was native to who they were. And so when we think about that, when you think about these real things, these tangible things that Southerners are writing about, real people, real events, real characters, and how important that was. If you just compare, for example, even antebellum Northern literature, it's almost abstract. Now, Nathaniel Hawthorne was writing about real things. They're boring books, but he was very critical of Northern society. And, of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne became an outspoken critic of the war. And so when you look at Southern literature, it's real. You can chew it. And I think that's something that makes it so good. It's not abstract. It's real. And so when you look at the life of William C. Faulkner, and then you compare that to The Unvanquished and the other William Faulkner and what he was writing about, his fictional Mississippi was actually a real Mississippi. And that's what made it so good. When you look at William Gilmore Simms, for example, his fictional South and fictional frontier and fictional stories of the American War for Independence weren't really that fictional because they were actually historical fiction. They're based on real people and real things. And, of course, he wrote a number of fine biographies and histories. And so his fiction was actually historical. It's real. Again, you can put your hands in it. It grounds you. And you find that a lot in Southern literature. That's why Flannery O'Connor is so good, because it's real. You just don't have that as much, that feeling as much with Northerners. Even modern fiction. There's a Ron Rash, who's a Southern writer. He's written a number of pretty interesting stories. But again, you get this feeling that they're real. They're based on people and things that have actually happened. And so you have that in Southern literature in a way that I just don't think you have it anywhere else. The stories make sense. And that's why people should read Southern literature. The stories make sense because they're built on something tangible, something real, something valuable, and that is the South in the Southern tradition. And so when you look at the continuity between the Old and the New South, you find that. We often think the New South was highly critical of the Old. It wasn't at all. New Southerner, people in the New South, and people even like Henry Grady, who was this prophet of the New South, spoke very nicely of the Old South. He said, look, I'm not trying to disparage the Old South. These people were great people. They were heroic. They had a lot to offer. But, of course, we need to look at a new economy. I've mentioned the Calloway family on this podcast before and written about it on the website, the Calloway family from Georgia, and how interested they were in the continuity between the New and the Old South. And that their job, they based their labor system, it was a paternalistic labor system, and you found that a lot in the South. It was a different type of labor system. They hadn't embraced Northeastern capitalism in a way where they just completely adopted their forms of their views of labor and society. The Calloways, one of the more famous members of the family, said at one point, he's essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, but he has cotton mills because he wants to make American citizens, and so he viewed labor differently. And even in the South today, you have companies like TSYS and Aflac, and they have a much more family-oriented environment than you have in other parts of the country, and that comes out of the South. That type of ideal for labor. But again, the continuity between the old and the new, we need to emphasize that more. So William Faulkner and William Faulkner, there's a lot of continuity there and what they thought of each other. And this actually bridges us into the piece on Wednesday, Jacobin Yankees by Clyde Wilson. This is a review, an older piece, but it's a review of Gangs of New York. And it's a very good film because it does show a couple of parts about Northern society that people often forget. And one thing Clyde points out is, one thing this film does is sheds light on the Lincolnite mythology of the Civil War era. He says, for one thing, the film gives a glimpse of the rather nasty nativism among Northerners, a great many of whom hated Catholics and immigrants as much or more than they hated Southerners. None of the above fit into the Yankee ideal of true Americanism, meaning Catholics and immigrants. Nativist gangs burned down convents in Philadelphia and Boston when such things were never dreamed of in the South. This window in the real history of the antebellum North becomes even more significant for three reasons. One, he says nativists of the American Party went en masse into Lincoln's Republican Party and made up a strong element of his support. This is very true. And of course, he talks about Richard Taylor's interaction with a German after the war, and the fact this German was trying to tell him how to be an American. And of course, Clyde says, does this maybe give you a little hint of where Straussians and neocons are coming from? These Germans made the most solid core of Lincoln's support, with the possible exception of tariff-protected manufacturers and New England intellectuals, quote-unquote. You also have, he says, it also opens the door to another little dirty secret, and that's the fact that vigilante law prevailed over much of the North during the war. You had wide-awake clubs which bullied people into support, mob violence. talks about the draft riots and how they actually didn't begin as riots, but as race pogroms, as they kind of show, but they started out as peaceful opposition to Lincoln's draft, and the fact that most Northerners of any means didn't have sons fighting in the war. The Rockefellers, Morgan, Gould, Swift, Armour, Goodyear. Only one of the Adamses fought in the war. Teddy Roosevelt's father bought an exemption. So, she brings up the fact that Sherman once complained that men of wealth were found in the ranks of the Southern Army and lamented that Northerners were not like that. So you had Southerners of all ranks, men of money, poor men, fighting in the war, but not in the North. And so he says this is a very good look into Northern society in a way that only film can do, because unfortunately we get most of our history today from film. And so one of the things that, and actually this is not it can be unfortunate, also be fortunate, because there are some good films. In fact, there was an article out yesterday that nobody reads academic journals anymore. Hallelujah. Because they're so bad. Maybe 10 people read an academic journal article. And it's probably less than that in most academic journal articles. So nobody's reading this stuff. Nobody's reading the New York Times. People are reading stuff like the Abbeville Institute website, which is good. And other online publications. And all these online publications are good, but regardless. So he mentions that you should read some other books. One is To Clear the Confederate Way, The Irish and the Army of Northern Virginia, and The Jewish Confederates. But he also talks about the fact that the Pope was actually going into Ireland and saying, look, don't go over to America to get slaughtered in the war. This is not in the interest of Irish. And there was a Dublin newspaper in 1861 that said, quote, we cannot but recollect that in the South our countrymen were safe from insult and persecution, while nativism and know-nothingism assailed them in the North. So it's a much more interesting look at Southern history. So a really good piece, Jacobin Yankees. Now, the piece on Wednesday, it's a part of a speech that John C. Calhoun delivered in the Senate in March of 1846. And the reason I put this up, first of all, the last line, he talks about why this war was happening, and he was against the war. He was not against expansion, but he was against the war. And so I bring this up because there's a book that just came out, in September, entitled This Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy. And it's written by a guy named Matthew Karp, and he's a professor at Princeton University. He's a young guy. He's actually from Maryland, lives in Brooklyn, but he's a assistant professor of history at Princeton University. And the book's selling fairly well. He's a left-winger, a radical left-winger. He writes for far-left websites. And his point of the book, and he actually did an interview with Salon magazine, and the main point of this particular book is to bash John C. Calhoun. That's essentially it. And talk about the slave power. So this is an old argument, right? I mean, if you study enough history and you study the antebellum period and the quote-unquote sectional conflict, you find that this slave power was the dominant rhetorical device that Northerners would use in the antebellum period to demonize the South. This is the slave power. Everything, the Mexican War was the slave power. All the conflict of the 1850s is all the slave power. Everything they're trying to do is to create a slavery empire, right? Texas was the slave power. And so all Karp does here is just regurgitate this old charge from the 1850s. And so this is an interesting, I guess, topic because what we're having in the 21st century is just a regurgitation of arguments that were made in the 19th century, packaged neatly in a Harvard University Press book, and then put out as something new and unique. And, of course, I believe he was a Bernie Sanders fan. And so in some ways, I mean, he's anti-elite. He always dresses, if you see any pictures of the guy, he always has a flannel shirt on to kind of look like one of them, right? He's one of the workers. He's out there for the workers. So this book is tinged with that from the beginning. But the reason I put this Calhoun speech up is to directly confront this idea that the slave power was behind every effort to expand. Because John C. Calhoun is recognized as, the defender of slavery, as Samuel Flagg Bemis called him. But when you read this speech on the Oregon question, at the end of it, he does talk about expansion. But it's not put in terms of, we want this land so we can have more slaves. We can have more slave territory. Calhoun, he was right. Calhoun was a nationalist. But he was not interested in war with Great Britain. He was not interested in war at all. He was opposed to the war with Mexico because he saw it as an expansion of executive power, an unconstitutional expansion of executive power. Yes, both John Tyler, President Tyler, and before he died, Abel Upshur, Secretary of State, did make slavery, the expansion of slavery, openly. They said that's what Texas is going to do, is going to allow this to happen. And of course, this is for years why Northerners opposed the admission of Texas into the Union. But Calhoun is much more nuanced. And so if you're going to make a book where it puts Calhoun in the center, and we've talked a lot about Calhoun, you better understand his position on things. Calhoun also defended the admission of Michigan into the Union as a non-slaveholding state, because this was the right of the state to do so. Congress had no authority in this issue. And so when you look at this particular speech he made on Oregon, he said, yeah, we're going to fill up the entirety of the North American continent. Absolutely. But he's defending Oregon, essentially. He knew full well Oregon was not going to be a slaveholding state. But he's talking about peace. And great line at the end. War may make us great, but let it never be forgotten that peace can only make us both great and free. And so when you look at Calhoun's worldview, and you look at his interest in the Union, and you look at his interest in expansion, he well understood that certain parts of the Union would not be slaveholding parts of the Union. They never would be. What Calhoun was interested in was ensuring, in his mind, that the common property of the United States was open to all people of the United States. And so when you look at the battle over slavery within context, as Michael Holt has accurately shown, this was a political conflict. Who would have power? And Calhoun understood that if you follow the northern line of logic, what they were trying to do is block the Southerners from expanding into territories because they wanted to ensure those territories became free states. Calhoun just was basically saying, look, give Southerners a chance, let them have property, let them take their slaves into those states. And again, in the 21st century, we look at this and we say, owning people is not a good thing. But in the 19th century, this was an accepted and legal thing. And so the context is important. But I think it's foolish, like I said, this twit from Princeton, it's foolish, this leftist twit from Princeton, who has again, a young guy going into Princeton, you look at his curriculum vitae, It's impressive from an academic standpoint if that's all you're interested in. He's got these presentations and these papers and these journal articles, and he's written this book. And so this guy he's got all the right contacts, Faulkner and McPherson. And this is, he is a professional resume patter, I think is the best way to put it. And so when you look at that, and you look at what he's saying in this book, there's nothing new here. He's just basically using the same argument that all of the opponents of expansion from the North in the 1840s used, people like Joshua Giddings and others. It's the slave power. It's the slaveocracy. And he says, only 2 presidents in the antebellum period didn't own slaves between 1789 and 1850. Only 2, and it was both Adamses. So up until 1850, all these people owned slaves, and so they were driving American foreign policy. And of course, he's turning things on his head because he says, look, Southerners were just trying to dominate the Union. Well, what were Northerners trying to do? Dominate the Union. So you get this idea by reading this and saying, wait a second here. So Southerners, Northerners were just good people. They just wanted the real America. These Southerners, they weren't that interested in union. They just wanted a Southern-dominated union. They didn't care about the North. It's interesting you bring up Calhoun. One of the reasons why the 1816 tariff was passed, and Calhoun was lambasted over this because he supported it. He basically was throwing a bone to the North. Look, we know during the War of 1812 things weren't too good for you, so here you go. Here's a revenue-producing tariff, slight protection. It can help you. We're sorry about the impact of the war on you manufacturers. Here you go. Of course, the lead into this little article in Dissent magazine is American history is a history driven by the intertwined forces of white supremacy, state power, and coerced labor. And it's a history that will persist long after the Confederacy's demise. And of course, the world-making ambitions of Southern elites that broke American democracy in two. So again, this is just, if you study the rhetoric of the 1850s, 1840s really, and you get this idea of the slave power, and this is what you're getting in this book. So I hope at some point we'll review this thing and just rip it apart, because it's trendy, it's fashionable, but it's garbage. Anyways, so I put this, or we put this piece of, the speech of John C. Calhoun to emphasize that Calhoun was much more complex than what a book like, this vast Southern Empire portrays him to be. Finally, on a high note, we left the week with Louis Grizzard, a little article that was written right after his death in 1995. And it talks about Grizzard and who he was as a young Grizzard at college, and the things that he got involved in, and the fact that he just loved to have a good time. And the fact that Grizzard was such a Southerner. And that one of the things he said, this is what Grizzard said one time. He said, the problem with the Yankees is that they don't know what to do after dinner. They don't know how to sit a spell and tell stories. And this goes back to the first two pieces of the week. And the author says, in this age of questioned values, it is a certainty that the man upstairs has a new guest for dinner, and when the dishes are cleared, the conversation is ever more spirited and lively. It's important to know, to understand, that Southerners tell stories, and that Grizzard's tales, his funny tales, were more about people and reality, which is what made them so funny, than anything else. Again, Southerners tell stories. They spin tales. They tell great stories because they're based on reality. They're not spun in some myth. They're true. They're real, good and bad. And so this is what makes the Southern tradition so valuable, and why I think we always need to hold on to it. People like Louis Grizzard, people like William Faulkner, people like Randall Ivey and Clyde Wilson, people like John C. Calhoun. It's the people that make the Southern tradition valuable and why we need to explore it. And so you can read this little piece on Grizzard. It's very short. But come away with that in the continuity between the first piece, which was a dark tale of Southern Gothic tale, to very light Louis Grizzard. But there's continuity between those things. And there's continuity between the Old and the New South, not what this little twit from Princeton would have you believe, but in something deeper and more meaningful, something more tangible. And if we can do that, if we can explore that Southern tradition, it will stay alive in us for generations to come. Until next time, good day.